It is Monday, January 22nd, 2018. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining us today is Mr. S. Jarvin Levison, retired attorney here in Atlanta, Georgia, past chairman of the 5th District Republican Executive Committee, and an emeritus board member at the William Brennan Jewish Heritage Museum here in Atlanta as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Levison. An honor and a pleasure. Thank you for inviting us into your home today to participate. Just to begin with, tell me a little bit about your childhood, your upbringing, how you got to Atlanta.
Okay, and by the way, I'm only semi-retired as an attorney.
Semi-retired?
Semi-retired. I still have an office with an accounting firm where I hang out. But anyhow, I was born in Bristol, Virginia in 1927. And my father and his brother had what was then considered a chain of shoe stores. But unfortunately, they lost it during the Depression. And in 1932, my father got a job in a women's wear store in Macon, Georgia, to be the manager. So we moved to Macon. And a year later, the owner of that store, who had maybe 8 or 10 stores at the time, decided to open a store in Atlanta, and my father moved to open the store in Atlanta. And that was probably in the summer of 1933, because I started first grade that fall, although I wasn't 6 years old at the time. The city of Atlanta's school system, you had to be 6 by the time school opened right after Labor Day, or you had to wait until the following year. But somehow my mother was persuasive enough to get me into school when I was still into the first grade when I was still 5. So I went to Inman, SM Inman as elementary school. Then junior high school, went to O'Keefe, and then boys high school.
Boys high?
And graduated boys high in January of 1945.
So tell me about your neighborhood. What was Atlanta like growing up there during the war?
Okay, well, we, of course, moved to Atlanta in 1933, which is pretty much the depths of the Depression. Although, as a 5-year-old, I really didn't know much about it, except, we'd hear it on radio or hear my parents speak about the times. But we, to the best of my recollection, didn't miss a meal. And the neighborhoods were close-knit. We moved into an apartment at 906 Briarcliff when we first moved here, and my recollection, there may have been 12 units in the apartment, and I think we knew everybody in the building. A few years later, we moved to a small house in the Virginia Highlands neighborhood. I have an older sister who fortunately is still living, and in 1937, a younger brother was born. And then sometime after that, we moved to a home on Pasadena Avenue, and then to a home on Homestead Avenue. And it seemed like about every 3 years we were able to upgrade slightly. My father became ill in 1949 and had some serious thoracic surgery. And he retired from the company he was with because his job, by 1950, he was managing some 50 stores in the Southeast. Okay. And it was just too much for him. And my parents were originally from Knoxville, Tennessee. and my father had an interest in a business in Knoxville. So they decided to move, my parents moved to Knoxville in 1950. An awful lot of people think I grew up in Knoxville because my older sister and brother both lived there and still live there. But I was in law school when my parents moved to Knoxville. So I've never lived in Knoxville. And so when people ask me about things in Knoxville, there's not much I can tell them. I refer them to my brother and sister. Yeah.
Now, did you grow up in, your father was a businessman. Did you grow up attuned to politics, or were you in a political family?
They're certainly not a political family. They were Roosevelt supporters in all of his elections. And of course, when Roosevelt died in 1945, when I was a freshman in college, frankly, I was the only president I had ever known.
Sure.
But I did have an interest in history, and somewhere became attracted to politics generally, without necessarily taking a position as to being a Democrat or a Republican or anything of that nature. But when I finished boys' high school in January of 1945, I was really 17 plus 2 months, and I started college at Chapel Hill. The war in Germany ended. I was naive enough to think that my country needed me to help win the war in Japan. So I went over to Durham, North Carolina, and joined the Naval Air Corps in the late spring of 1945. And after joining, they told me I didn't have enough education to go to flight school. I was finishing my first semester in college. And they said, well, they'll send me to college to get 2 years of college before I go to flight school. And my orders were to report to Emory University, which was 2 miles from home. So I joined the Navy 400 miles away from home, and they sent me home. And of course, in August, the war in Japan ended. And at the end of that semester, they closed the Navy unit at Emory. They still didn't know what to do with us because the war was just over. But they closed that unit and transferred us to Georgia Tech. And those of us that were in the Naval V5 program at Georgia Tech, we were there 2 more semesters. I finished my junior year, and then they gave us a choice of getting out and being classified 1A, going to boot camp, and after 17 weeks later, getting out and being classified 4A, or staying in the program. Well, in that year, I learned enough that I really didn't want to fly airplanes off of carriers because I'd have to land it. So
it's a crucial part.
But I was still naive enough to think that, okay, the war to end all wars has ended. So I got out and got classified 1A, thinking, that's it, I don't ever have to worry about doing anything, going back into service again. And so I had finished my junior year. I was still 18 and a half. I went back to Emory and finished the business school at Emory. And I finished the business school at Emory in June of 48 and started law school.
So why did you make the decision to jump into law school after here you are wanting to be a naval pilot? Maybe I'll test out the courtroom.
I majored in accounting in business school, and in June of 1948 with all the returnees from service who were older and many of whom had actually experience in the accounting field. There weren't any jobs available.
Okay.
The only job I can recall that I was offered was a traveling salesman to sell stationery. That didn't appeal to me, so I guess I took the relatively easy way out. I was still, in the summer of 1948, I was still 20 years old, and so I went to law school at Emory.
Now, 1948, there was a relatively historic presidential election.
Yes.
Did you get involved in any of the Dewey activities, or
Well,
I guess...
when I was in 1945,
Okay.
when I was transferred to Georgia Tech, and I was there 8 months. There was a gubernatorial election in 1946.
Yes, there was. Jimmy Carmichael.
Jimmy Carmichael against Eugene Talmadge. And I know I was strongly opposed to Eugene Talmadge for any number of reasons. By that time, I had begun to think poorly of Southern Democrat politicians, primarily because they were avowed racists. Welcome support of the Ku Klux Klan. It just seemed that however I was developing, it was in opposition to them. And frankly, if they were anti-Negro, they very likely were also anti-Jewish. And I could remember prior to leaving Bristol, Virginia, at 4 years old, one night my father turned off the lights in the house, and we watched, barely looking over the windowsill, a Klan parade on horses with all of them with their white sheets and hansard riding down the street, which was a very frightening experience. It
Sure.
stuck with me all of my life. Anyhow, I did go with a group of guys from the Navy, Georgia Tech, to a rally that Eugene Talmadge was having. And I guess we started shouting questions and such that it was disruptive. And the police chased us out of the out of the theater where the rally was being held. And I don't think they knew we were in the Navy. We were able to disappear before they found us, and they didn't know who the people were that were so obnoxious. And so I was fairly observant of both local and national politics. So in 1948, I was supportive of Dewey. That was the first presidential election I ever voted in. I was supportive of Dewey because really the first 2 or 3 years of Truman's administration, it seemed to me that most of his appointees seemed to be buddies, poker playing, whiskey drinking guys that, James Burns from South Carolina, Tom Clark from Texas. He got his start in the Pendergrass administration. Only later, some of the things that he did, primarily through what he was able to accomplish in foreign affairs, did he become a well-known and accepted political figure. But in the early days and during so much of his administration, it was an awful lot of cronyism. And when I was at Emory Law School, in prelude to the 52 election, I was an Ard Eisenhower supporter. But it was all on campus. I wasn't beyond, I wasn't active beyond that. Although I was, impressed with Adlai Stevenson, I really was very much impressed with Eisenhower. I finished law school in January of '51. And during law school, I was first in what I called an errand boy, a gopher, in the law offices of Mr. Herbert Hass. Mr. Hass had, I guess there were 6 or 7 other attorneys that were in that office, one of whom was his son, Joseph. And Joe and another attorney, Saul Golden, were partners. Saul Golden was somewhat older than Joe Hass. And in 1949, when I had started law school in 48, 49, I was the errand boy. And Saul Golden joined up with Ellis Arnold and a fellow named Cleveland Gregory. And they opened their law office in the same building in which Mr. Herbert Hass had his law offices, and that was in the old First National Bank building at 5 Points. So I became the errand boy for both law firms. And they were, I did get to research stuff occasionally.
Sure.
And when I finished law school in January of '51, I became affiliated with Arnold, Golden, and Gregory. And during the period of time I was in law school, Ellis Arnold liked to talk politics.
Oh, yes.
And Mr. Golden and Mr. Gregory were always very busy practicing law. And Ellis occasionally would handle some litigation, but primarily he was out to generate clients. So when he was in the office and wanted to have somebody to talk politics with, he drafted me. And I enjoyed those times immensely. Anyhow, he told me of his experience of visiting Truman. And when he came out of the White House and he predicted Truman was going to win, I think Truman said, well, at least one of us was predicting that I would win. Something like that. I liked Ellis, but he did indulge in hyperbole, to say the least. Anyhow, there was one other fella that was also at Arnold, Golden, Gregory at the time, and he had started just a few months before me. It was Charlie Weltner. Charlie and I realized in late spring he had never been in the service, and although I had been in service, I was still classified 1A, and the Korean War had broken out the summer before. So he decided he should enlist in the Judge Advocate Corps or Judge Advocate Program or whatever of the Air Force. And I thought I'd do the same thing, and went out to Warner Robins, got the forms, came back, and that very day found postcard in my mail that I had been reclassified from 1A to 4A. So I put the enlistment papers down, and that ended that. Unfortunately, I never went into service. However, in June of 1951, at the encouragement of Mr. Herbert Hass, who I was still close to, I sought a position in the Chief Counsel's Office of Internal Revenue Service because my interest in the field of law was in taxation. And through a couple of letters he wrote, I ended up getting an interview with the chief counsel and the head of personnel. And actually, there were discussions at the time that my interview was scheduled to try to decide how to fill some vacancies they had in various field offices because Truman or Congress, I'm not sure which, had enacted or issued an executive order that no new positions would be filled after June 30 that year. Mm-hmm. They were trying to control the expenditures of the federal government. And so they had half dozen or so positions for attorneys available. And up to that point, it had been very difficult to get a job, but I happened to be there at the right time, at the right place. And they offered me an opportunity to take an open position in the New York City office. So I took it at the grand annual salary of $3,800 a year.
In New York City?
In New York City, which I thought Atlanta was great. Then I got to New York City and realized that it was going to cost $75 a month to park my car.
That's why nobody drives in New York.
Anyhow, I survived. And of course, being in government service for 4.5 years, I may have taught politics, but I wasn't active in politics.
Sure. So when did you make your way back from New York?
I came back in January of 1956, and I joined what was then called the Hass Holland Blackshear law firm. Mr. Herbert Hass had died, and his son and J. Kurt Holland and Hardeman Blackshear formed a firm very similar in nature to Arnold Golden Gregory. I think Arnold Golden Gregory may have had 5 or 6 lawyers, and Arnold Golden Gregory had 5 or 6 lawyers, and the Hass Holland Blackshear had 5. I made the 6.
Now, were these law firms mainly tax, corporate law, or was it more a general practice?
Somewhat general. Arnold Golden Gregory, basically Gregory was the chief litigator. Saul Golden was the corporate, and Ellett was sort of in between. Hass Holland and Blackshear was the litigator, and Hass and Holland were the corporate types.
Okay.
So they're basically the same size, but Hass Holland and Arnold Golden, the principals were very close friends and stayed that way basically all their lives. And so I had the relationship also. I continued to have the relationship with Arnold Golden. Mm-hmm. Skipping way ahead, in 1982, 10 of us from the Hass Holland firm, we were about 20 at the time, and the Arnold Golden Gregory firm was about 20. 10 of us from Hass Holland and joined up with Arnold Golden. And so I continued I became a partner at Arnold Golden Gregory in July of '82 and remained there until the end of 2014. At that time, I retired from Arnold Golden and have an office over in the accounting firm of Steve Berman and Associates. Steve and I had a number of mutual clients and were co-trustees of various trusts for some client firms, so that just made it easier.
Right. Now, we'll skipped ahead for a second. Did you practice in the same firm as Robert Lipschitz? When he went up to be White House counsel?
Before he went, his firm was called Lipschitz Macy, and at one time Franklin, but Franklin left and joined another firm. And all three of those fellows had been college friends and law school friends. But when Bobby left, when he was ready to leave the Carter White House, he was a few years older than me, but we were pretty friendly. Mm-hmm. And the Hess-Holland group decided we would try to get Bobby to come join Hess-Holland because, hey, here's the White House counsel. That'll really enhance our status. So I went up to see him, and we worked out an arrangement where he would come join Hess-Holland. The firm was called Hess-Holland, Levison, and Jabert, and we agreed to put his name after Holland, so it was Hess-Holland, Lipschitz, Levison, and Jabert. Most of us still referred to it as Hess-Holland.
Just when he wasn't in the room. Okay, so we're back 1956, so second Eisenhower administration. How do you get involved formally in Republican politics in Atlanta?
Okay. Came back in January of 1956, and maybe I ought to ask you a question. Wasn't that the year that Randolph Thrower ran for Congress?
It was, yeah. Against Judge Davis.
Right. And Randolph had been an adjunct professor of mine at Emory. And so his law firm, Sutherland, Asbell, and Brennan, formerly Sutherland, Tuttle, and Brennan, was in the same building, in the First National Bank. Everybody seemed to be in that building, at least whatever. And so I, did a few things, got active. But I can't say I was real active. Of course, disappointed that he didn't win. Randolph and Margaret Shaw are really two fine human beings. Aside from his being a super lawyer, super tax lawyer, ethical leader throughout the bar and the city. Anyhow, I got married in June of '57, and I guess it was somewhat after that I began inquiring around. I had a partner at Hess-Holland, Richard Freeman, who was an outspoken critic of just about everything. Anyhow, I met Mac Johnston, who was a lawyer, somewhat active in some Republican circles, but the only one that was close to me in age. He was older than I, and decided we'd try to organize, or he, as a leader of young Republicans, we'd start a Young Republican Club on the north side. And the first Young Republican meeting I went to was at the home of June and Doug Smith, and it was really June Smith who was active, not Doug, but June Smith and Mac Johnson and me. That was it. That was our Young Republican Club.
The Three Musketeers.
Didn't last much longer. Anyhow, gradually, Richard Freeman became interested. Rodney Cook became interested. Alex Beeler became interested. Mike Egan became interested. And while I was the youngest in that group, we were all somewhat younger than the Randolph Thorers and the Charlie Moyes and what have you. Excuse me. At some point, at this moment, I think it may have been before the 1960 election, but it was certainly before the 1961 City of Atlanta elections. We started meeting for breakfast and decided we would approach Randolph to create a group that would prepare a newsletter that we could send around to people. And it was mostly all dealing with local activities. And he readily endorsed it. Anything that sort of expand means of communication. Of course, we didn't have the means of doing it as we do today. And then he joined us for breakfast, and we'd meet once a week. I think it was once a week. And finally, after the 60 election, which was somewhat of a disappointment, obviously, we geared up to try to convince some people to run for the city council. And we got Richard Freeman and Rodney Cook. And so Alex Beeler and Mike Egan.
Was Dan McIntyre?
Dan wasn't involved at that point yet.
He was slightly out.
Yeah. Okay. For some reason, Mac Johnson really didn't think we were going to have much success, so he went his own way. And I remember, I think it was Richard, Rodney, and me. There may have been a fourth. We went to see Gene Patterson, who was then the editor of the Constitution, to see if we did run candidates as known Republicans. Would the newspaper give them a fair break? He didn't realize that the city election was nonpartisan, so we had to explain all that to him. And we did, and he said that, they would not treat us unfairly just because we were Republicans. Because the newspaper was, Cox newspaper was solidly, it's not like it is today where they even have occasionally op-ed people on the right. Anyhow, Rodney and Richard were successful. and it sort of opened the eyes of people around that, hey, we might be able to do something, improve the lot. And in '62, before the collapse of the county unit system, we'd gotten Jim O'Callahan, L.J. O'Callahan, to agree to run for the 5th District, a congressional seat, against Judge Davis. And by that time, we had already had 2 years of involvement with the African American community Republicans. And to me, John Calhoun was the key, because he had an organizational ability that really I thought was superb. I can remember early on, he arranged a luncheon at a restaurant on Auburn Avenue. I think it was called B.B. Beeman's, B-E-A-M-O-N, B.B. Beeman's. Great food. He had all of the important African American ministers. William Holmes Borders, Daddy King, and it was to get them to endorse Jim O'Callahan, which they did. And then it's my recollection the county unit system case ended the county unit system. After that, Charlie Weltner had already qualified against Judge Davis. And there's an African American Voters League.
It was Anvil. Yeah. Was it Atlanta Negro Voters League?
Maybe that was Atlanta Negro Voters League, where supposedly Republicans and Democrats would get together and endorse a candidate. And some young Republican African Americans, C. Clayton Powell was one of them, and maybe T.M. Alexander Jr. Wasn't Q.B. Williamson. But anyhow, they got that group to endorse Weltner. And we heard about the proposed endorsement, I think the day before. I think John Calhoun alerted us that we got to do something. We got to stop it. He said, because once you get somebody to vote for somebody, you can never turn them around. That's something that the Callaway crowd didn't learn when they got people to vote for Lester Maddox a few years later. Anyhow, we were unsuccessful. And but we thought, okay, we've already got the ministers to endorse him, so we got some conflicting things. But Charlie not only beat Judge Davis, he beat Jim O'Callahan. It was 1962, also was the Gubernatorial Election.
Yep.
And we had gotten Ed Smith on the ballot. And we got Eisenhower to come to Atlanta. I think Bob Snodgrass got Eisenhower to come to Atlanta as a fundraiser for Ed. It was at the Biltmore Hotel. And I remember very distinctly that night asking Ed if they were planning to stay overnight. He said, no, we're going to drive back to Columbus. And I said, who's your driver? He said, no, Marilyn and I can do it, no problem. And of course, he fell asleep, ran off the road, ran into traffic coming the other way. After that, this really, I'm not sure who ever knew it besides four of us. Carl Sanders, who was, in a race against Marvin Griffin, contacted Randolph and asked if Randolph and whoever he wanted would meet with him and J.B. Fuqua, which we did in conference room in Randolph's offices. And interesting, I don't think J.B. ever spoke. Of course, he was known. And when he did start speaking later on, and he wasn't paying much attention to, but as long as he did talk, everybody thought, he's powerful. Anyhow, and of course, he was the money man behind Carl at the time. Carl wanted to know if we would help turn out the African-American vote for him since we no longer had a candidate. And because he knew we wouldn't, the Republicans did not like Marvin Griffin, so we said we'd do what we could. But if we helped, we wanted Carl not to constantly belittle Republicans, and we wanted him to stay out of the 5th District congressional race. Since we had no candidate for governor, if he got nominated in the Democratic primary, he would be elected. So we just wanted him to stay out of the Weltner-O'Callahan race. And he agreed.
I never heard that before.
Nobody ever knew it. J.B. would have never told anybody, nor would Carl Sanders. And Randolph and I kept it to ourselves. But Charlie, later on, couldn't understand. He was really frustrated because why wouldn't Carl Sanders, the Republican nominee, come out and endorse him? He didn't do anything. And there was some frustration there.
Sure.
Anyhow, it worked. And we, of course, immediately after that conference, I called John Calhoun. And by that time, I think as Republicans, we couldn't expect much in the way of African-American support.
So, in the lead up to the 64 presidential election, there had been some rumblings that Barry Goldwater was going to, he was going to run in 1960, or at least, have a challenge on the floor at the convention. He told conservatives they needed to grow up, and Nixon was nominated in 1960. How aware were you of the ongoing draft Goldwater movement that was going on in the South and in the state of Georgia with Goldwater supporters?
Well, let me step back.
Sure.
Prior, early on after Jim O'Callahan was chosen to be the Republican nominee, Bob Snodgrass convinced Barry Goldwater to visit Atlanta and meet with some Republicans to help guide them or give them his wisdom how to get Jim O'Callahan elected. And on some trip on his way back to Arizona, which he did. And there were probably 15 or 20 of us in a meeting out at the airport. And he had plenty of time between planes, so he had 2 or 3 drinks. And very affable fellow, very affable.
2 or 3 drinks will do that.
Yeah, for anybody. And we told him we were, like his advice, we needed to raise, I think we said $75,000 for Jim's campaign. $75,000. He said, I didn't have to spend that much on my last senatorial campaign. Oh, so we didn't get any advice from him as to how to raise money. But we liked him. Probably didn't think he could be a serious candidate. Not that we were actively opposed to him. I don't think our crowd was really ever actively opposed to him. We were more for either Goldwater later on. I'm sorry, not Goldwater, but Rockefeller. But, we were aware that with the civil rights legislation that was being passed and Goldwater's opposition to it, which I thought was absolutely political from his viewpoint, because considering how he had taken position for a very long period of time that American Indians were really treated terribly by Americans, that he, in my mind, wouldn't have on his own distinguished between the American Indians being treated unfairly and African Americans being treated unfairly.
And the history of his family's department store out in Arizona.
So it was a pure political decision on his part. But we saw it was growing, and we also saw that Roscoe Pickett was stirring up the crowd. Somebody referred to Roscoe as a friendly bandit, and at least he's our bandit. He's not somebody else's bandit. I don't know how that came about, but I remember long after that, at some subsequent meeting after the '64 election, Roscoe was still active in something, and as I was. And at some meeting, we realized we were both voting on the same side or something. And we looked at each other and both sort of said out loud, something must be wrong here. We couldn't both be supporting the same thing.
So, at this point, I think you're vice chair of the 5th District?
I think I was vice chair of the county.
Maybe it was the county.
And I think Randolph, and I was sort of going to be probably the chairman.
Right.
At least they thought I should be the chairman. And Randolph one time told me that he thought there was sufficient anti-Semitism within the party in Fulton County that I wouldn't get it, but that we could probably work out something where I'd end up as chairman of the 5th District. And so that's when part of the negotiations, we agreed to Don Whittemore.
Negotiations with the Goldwater crowd.
It was basically Roscoe.
Ross. Well, there were some others because Roscoe was living in DeKalb County.
Yeah, but he was.
But he was still kind of the man, the power behind the scenes.
Yeah, well, he was more of their political guru within the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. Everybody else were Democrats moving in, and it seemed like to us anyhow.
Now there were some others. Bill Dowda, Dr. Dowda, who was.
But Dowda, Ed Noble, all those guys were with us in the early 60s. When I say with us, part of what we were trying to get done, create people to run for office, encourage people to run for office, expand people who would acknowledge they're Republicans. And they became supportive of Goldwater. But we didn't have there wasn't the same antagonism, in my view, mm-hmm. between Bob Redford. There was a group, Bob was in a group that was called the Loose Group. Julian LaCroix was in it, Charlie West. Initially, I don't think they viewed themselves as Republicans. I think they viewed themselves as just businessmen who was willing to put money behind good candidates. But then they became, Goldwater and more conservative. And there were 15 or 20 of those fellows. I don't remember all of them. Redfern was one. I want to say Alan Harden, contractor, but Julian certainly was. He was one of the younger ones.
I think there was a reference to a later story about in the mid '70s, after when Machine Gun Ronnie was the Republican nominee. Some of the names that showed up in an article were Alex Smith, Gene Milner,
yes.
Wesley Moran, Dan Shepard, Thornton Kennedy, and William Alexander were some of the names that were thrown around.
Well, Wesley Moran, these were all guys that made money or inherited it, like Thornton Kennedy. And they were probably viewed themselves conservative, whether they were, to me, they were not like the Southern Democrat politicians that were racist. I just didn't view those guys that way. Although Bill Alexander, I don't remember. Alex Smith was an attorney, as was his father, and his wife was in the Haverty family of the Haverty Furniture. I guess he has a son. It's Alex III. That's I think the current CEO of Haverty's. Trying to think who else. I don't necessarily remember them being, well, maybe late 60s, early 70s. at one time, Alex Smith was considering running for mayor. I don't exactly remember when that was. And he agreed to be interviewed on Ring Radio. Couldn't answer any questions that was asked by the MC. So he decided he wouldn't run.
Thus endeth the candidacy.
Yeah. Now there was an architect, Cecil Alexander, but I don't remember that he necessarily was in that group. He was very civic-minded, and his uncle was a man named Henry A. Alexander.
That's an old Republican name.
That's an old Republican. He used to run for Congress.
As an independent.
Well, I thought he ran as a Republican. Maybe he ran as an independent, but I thought he ran as, and financed his own campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And he used to live at the end of a driveway that everybody thought was an extension of Lennox Road, across Beach Street, drove down into his estate, which is where Phipps Plaza is now.
So there was something of a showdown at the Fulton County Republican Convention in '64. But as you've already alluded to, that there were negotiations. Did you already know that your side, the Rockefeller, Scranton, call it the liberal Republicans, were going to lose out, to that the Goldwater sentiment was significant?
Well, we knew it was significant. I'm sort of right now getting the county convention a bit mixed up with the state convention.
The county one would have been in February of '64, and then the state convention, that's one where Joe Tribble defeated, I think, Alex Beeler for state chairman, and then Roscoe Pickett became the national committeeman over Bob Snodgrass.
I remember at the state convention, I was sitting next to John Calhoun and Ralph Ivy was the parliamentarian. Somehow Dick Denny was in there too. What role did Dick Denny have? Was he temporary chairman?
He might have been
chair of the meeting.
I think Ralph Ivy became the chair.
Chair, okay. Maybe Dick Denny became the parliamentarian.
I think that's right.
Anyhow, Ralph was a nice guy, but not too swift. Anyhow, John Calhoun stands up, gets recognition, and he says, "I have a motion of unreadiness." I said, "John, there isn't any such thing." He said, "We aren't ready, are we?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, let's see if we can delay them." So it sent them to the parliamentarian, tried to analyze what is a motion. They finally ruled it was out of order and they moved on. But it was over the Fulton County leadership that we had the negotiations. And I cannot remember who was there besides Roscoe on the other side.
Let's see. I think it may have been Dowda, Whitney O'Keefe, perhaps.
It could have been Whitney.
I don't know if Dillard Munford was folded in yet.
Dillard wouldn't have been there.
Redfern, LaCroix.
Possibly LaCroix, but I don't believe Redfern was there.
But those are the, I'm digging into my memory here. Those, I think, were the main and as soon as I,
Well, on our side was Randolph. I'm pretty sure Mike Egan, Rodney Cook, and me, and maybe Richard Freeman, maybe.
would Snodgrass have been there?
No.
No.
I believe we all agreed in advance that Randolph would do all the talking. We thought he really outmaneuvered. We recessed a couple of times to talk. And we were in, it's possible Ed Noble was there because we were in a conference room or a motel room at his motel at the 14th Street exit of the expressway. But we agreed with that Don Whittemore would be county chairman, and I think was Julian LaCroix vice chairman.
I believe it was definitely that your group had the chair, and then the Goldwater crowd
And
would have vice chair.
I would have the chair of the 5th District, and Whitney O'Keefe would be vice chair.
Yep. and did that agreement hold?
Yes.
But there were some upset, within the convention that were there some hardliners, because I'm remembering if the minutes of the meeting that are in Randolph Thrower's papers are correct, there were at least some of the Goldwater crowd that really just wanted a clean sweep.
Probably. But I think my recollection is that the agreement we negotiated held firm. I'm trying to remember what role, if any, William Armstrong Smith played. In I think it was the 62 election. That's when Dan McIntyre, Joe Tribble, and William Armstrong Smith were elected as known Republicans to the state Senate. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember if there were any members of the House. When did Rodney get elected to the... I don't remember now.
60. Would it have been in the 65 after the reapportionment? There would have been that special election in June of 65.
I don't remember the moment.
Ben Jordan was elected out of sort of Smyrna. That would have been 64. Okay. I'm not sure if Rodney Cook was elected in 64, or if he was elected. I want to say he was elected in the 65 special.
Because in 62, after that election, I remember, Joe Tribble was stubborn, and Armstrong was maybe a fellow from Boston. Originally was one of the most conservative people I've ever known.
And he was out of South Fulton County.
Yeah, but he moved here from Brunswick. He was in the paint business, actually road paint, yellow paint down. Anyhow, I remember getting together with the three of them and offered to put together a group of fellows to research any issue they wanted. So they could take a position as a threesome. Joe wasn't interested. His view was go along and get along with the Democrats because more could be accomplished. I don't think he ever accomplished anything, frankly. As a state senator, Armstrong was very critical of the liberal Republicans. However, a couple of years later, he engaged me as an attorney, and I represented him all the rest of his life, his son, 2 daughters, and now some grandchildren.
Funny how life works out.
Yeah. But he also sent me a subscription to a monthly publication called Jews for Jesus.
Oh, goodness.
And I said, well, thank you very much, Armstrong, but you could save your money on that one.
So when Goldwater, the Goldwater supporters carried the county convention and the state convention, what was your reaction? What were you concerned immediately that this was going to be a problem for Republicans like you, who had the views and issues that you support?
Not locally. I really, I was a delegate to the convention,
Right.
And our convention instructed its delegates to vote for Goldwater until released.
Right.
My alternate was Q.B. Williamson. When I got to San Francisco, I met with who's the head of the Goldwater organization in Georgia. Or maybe it was the fellow from Alabama, John
Grenier.
John Grenier.
Yeah.
And I said to him, which I later said to some media folks, I worked in local campaigns for a long time, and I just know that when you have to stop and explain what your candidate said, you're way behind. And I think we have a problem with Senator Goldwater because we are so frequently trying to explain what he said. So under those circumstances, I don't think he's the best candidate we could have to run against Lyndon Johnson. Not that it probably would have mattered one iota who would have run against Lyndon Johnson at that time. And I said, so I would like for you to request Senator Goldwater to release me so I can vote for whoever I think would best be the best candidate for us. I've never heard back, of course. I'm not sure that John Grenier or whoever I made that request of ever passed it on. But at the convention that night, before the proceedings started, I advised, who was the chairman of our delegation? I can't remember. Anyhow,
It might have been Callaway.
It may have been.
May have been.
I was going to withdraw as a delegate because I just did not think I could vote as instructed for somebody. I just thought we'd have to explain everything he ever said. And I stepped aside, and that was okay with them, except QB said he wasn't stepping aside and he wasn't voting for Goldwater. So I left the convention floor. So I never knew what really happened except what QB told me. And I think Julian, who became a good friend, was trying to claim, wait a minute, the alternates were not identified as to who they should be, and therefore our convention should elect who should be Jarvin's alternate. QB insisted that he be the alternate. and claimed he was. So I think he voted for Scranton.
Scranton would have been the anti
Right.
Goldwater candidate at that point, anyway.
Tom Addison was an alternate, and I remember we did not stay for the vote, and we certainly didn't stay for the speech.
Oh, so you weren't on the floor for the extremism speech?
We heard it in the restaurant we went to, and I thought, well, you just confirmed what I said. But I do remember that night, Tom's wife, Dot Addison, who incidentally is still living, I guess in her view it's not incidental, but she made a comment that has stayed with me all my life. She said, even the best of us are moderate bigots. I thought that was a very profound statement. And she's right. When you think about it, even if you think of yourself as being very compassionate and very understanding of every other race, religion, gender, whatever, you still have prejudices. So,
well, what did she make that statement in relation? What prompted that? What was it?
Well,
was it
we just heard the extremism statement.
Okay. I was wondering, how. So, you come back to Georgia. There's a campaign on Goldwater. Did you expect Goldwater to win Georgia?
Well, since he did, I'm not so sure I could say that beforehand I thought he would or he wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really recall. I remember that I called a meeting of the 5th District Committee because I figured they'd be up in arms. But to make sure that Whitney O'Keefe wasn't out stirring them up, I asked him to sit up on the platform with me. But since I was presiding, he was behind me. I didn't have to recognize him. So we got through that night pretty easily. And, being the chairman of the 5th District, I was on the state committee.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a few guys like Paul Jones from Macon, who over time, I think, got over some of us not being rah-rah Goldwater supporters, and also had enough sense themselves to realize that you needed support from lots of folks to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
Oliver Bateman, who I think evolved into what I would consider a very moderate Republican.
What did you think were you surprised at how lasting the effect of the Goldwater campaign and his vote against the '64 Civil Rights Act, how permanent that sort of disruption, that separation of African American support for Republican candidates, that it was so quick and long lasting? I think it was less than 1% of African Americans voted for Goldwater in Georgia in '64.
Well, terribly disappointed. But the Democrats knew how to exploit it, and the Republicans had deaf ears. They figured that a white majority in Georgia was going to be dominant for as far as they could see in the future. What they didn't comprehend, if all segments of society are progressing economically and socially, then your community won't progress as far as it could economically and socially. And we still, unfortunately, have that viewpoint.
Right, right. So you were still 5th District chairman. Were you 5th District chairman during the '66 elections with Bo Calloway for governor and Fletcher Thompson here in Atlanta in the 5th District?
I think I was.
So what did it mean to finally be able to elect a Republican congressman? And now, obviously, Fletcher Thompson was a bit more from the right side of the party than you had.
But a sincere fellow. Just,
Sure.
Is he living?
I believe so. Last I heard, anyway. He and Ben Blackburn both.
Ben's still living?
As far as I know.
I think Ben's older than I am, but I think Fletcher's younger. I'm not positive. I think Ben was in the same Naval Air Corps unit I was in at Emory. And I think he was there before me. He may be a year older than me. I haven't heard his name mentioned in years. Fletcher was really a rather oddity.
How so?
Well, Charlie Weltner, after the Democratic primary, withdrew because he didn't want to appear on the same ticket as Lester Maddox. And they had to scramble to come up with somebody to run. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, I can't remember who that was.
I think it was Archie Lindsay. I think they roped Archie Lindsay into.
Was he a county commissioner?
He was, or he was a former county commissioner. It was something like that. Yes.
I mean, I'd known Charlie from when he and I were at Arnold Golden in 1951, and I mean, he was doing it out of his conscience. But who did not withdraw from the Democratic ticket in 1966? It ran for the state legislature.
Everybody else.
Julian Bond. I'm fairly confident that Julian Bond was elected to the Georgia House in 1966.
So if Julian Bond could stay on the ticket, Charlie Weltner probably would have been reelected. Would be my assumption. Would have been my assumption.
Yes, I think we all assumed he would be. And, I thought, okay, Charlie's got a conscience, Julian doesn't.
Now, of course, it took the support of Republicans like Rodney Cook to vote for seating Julian Bond in this under the dome,
right?
Because of his opposition to the Vietnam War. What do you think it would have meant organizationally and morale-wise had Bo Calloway been able to? He won the popular vote, but as we know, that didn't really matter at the time. What would it have meant to the party if Bo Calloway could have won?
He got more popular votes than Lester. He
Correct.
Just didn't get a majority.
Right. A plurality didn't do it.
No. And Ellis Arnold was the one who got Lester elected. Well, I think he would have advanced the Republican Party development and control in Georgia a lot sooner than ultimately occurred. I mean, it took a long time.
Sure.
politically, Bo did a few things that were good, right, I should say, and some that I would have thought some long ago Georgia Democrats would have done. And then there were some things that one of his longtime friends said to me, well, he's a Callaway, and if you know the Callaways, you can understand him. I said, well, I don't know the Callaways. For instance, his kickoff was the first time any candidate had ever had their kickoff in Atlanta. And a fellow named Jack Barnett and I organized the parade down Peachtree. Has that name popped up, Jack Barnett?
No.
Okay. So we've got this parade going down Peachtree, and Jack and I were in a bus. There must be 10 cars between us and the lead car, which had Bo and Beth Callaway. Convertible, they were sitting up on the back of the convertible. And it got bogged down, stopped. We were creeping, really creeping along. So I get out of the bus to go up to see this crowd that's basically stopped the parade. And I go over to Bo and I said, Bo, when it stops like this, you ought to get out of the car and go shake hands with all the people along the route. Oh, I couldn't do that. That was his comment to me. And then we get down to Hurt Park and he made his speech, and that was the highlight of his whole campaign. That was it. From that point, it went downhill.
And do you think it was just...
Well, when the family friend, when I mentioned to him about his not getting out of the car to shake hands, he said, well, you know the Callaways, you'll understand. I said, okay, I don't know.
So Callaway loses out. Lester Maddox becomes governor.
Yes.
Despite all the predictions and the support that Callaway had from Republicans and establishment, fellows in Atlanta. John Sibley comes to mind. Coca-Cola money. Bob Woodruff.
Well, the Callaway family had a very significant influence in the business community of Georgia. Bo's father and Bob Woodruff were close and on the boards of U.S. Steel or something. I'm not sure.
Case and Callaway. Later on, when Bo was running for governor, he had a fundraiser up in New York City that was organized by Richard Nixon at one of the clubs that Nixon was a member of, and on the list of guests were U.S. Steel and all these big chemical companies, investment banks, and things like that. And I have to imagine that the Callaway name was familiar to many of those individuals, coming out of the textile industries in Georgia. So in '68, with Richard Nixon running again for a second time, where were you in the sort of in Georgia, or I guess nationwide? It was a Nixon, Rockefeller, Reagan race, of sort of a 3-horse race for the nomination that year.
Well, I'm sure that among the three, to the extent that Rockefeller was running hard, I was supportive of Rockefeller. Nixon's original campaign for the U.S. Senate always sort of disturbed me, the way he seemed to attack his opponent, Douglas,
Helen
Hagen Douglas.
Yep.
And I saw Reagan and George Murphy at the 1964 convention. And here were, two entertainers making a speech together. And then as governor of California, I wasn't aware of anything that impressed me as being a significantly important Republican governor. Big state, but I just wasn't impressed. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that there was some effort by Rockefeller, I was supportive, but I don't think that lasted very long.
No, it was. It came down between who could swing more of the conservative votes out of the South.
Yeah,
Reagan or Nixon, and Strom Thurmond signed on to the
right.
Nixon effort. So, did you remain as active in Republican politics after the '60s? After the party started to shift more and more to the right.
Well, when Rodney Cook ran for
in '69, right,
for mayor, I don't know whether I was his finance chair or just took on the task of trying to raise money. But during that campaign is when I met Paul Coverdale. Paul was the campaign chairman. I frankly don't know where Rodney found him, where he had been. He could have been active, and I just missed it for a couple of years. I'm not sure. And at some point, and I think it was in the late 60s, when the state first created a state election board or commission. And the first appointees was the Republican Party would appoint someone, the Democratic Party would appoint someone, Ben Fortson, who was the Secretary of State, of course, ran the elections. We were three, and I think either the governor appointed two, or one was appointed by the House and one was appointed by the Senate. And so I was a Republican appointee to that state election board. And I don't recall who was the chairman of the party at the time.
What year would that have been?
I'd have to go back and try to find out when was the board first created.
Well, Paul Jones was chairman after Tribble, so about 65 to 69, and then Wiley Wasden,
it could have been either Paul or Wiley. Mm-hmm. Either one of them could have.
Wiley was there from, I think, late 69 to right after he didn't survive the House suit, Jimmy Bentley.
A long time ago. Mm-hmm. But one of those, either Paul or Wiley, appointed me.
So you were. What was it like raising money? I guess it would have been easier raising money for Rodney Cook in Atlanta at that time than any other part of the state.
Well, that's true. We were actually, Paul and I worked together. That's when we were really sort of bonded. Mm-hmm. We were trying to get two things done. We were trying to raise money from the business community, and we were trying to figure out a way to get Ivan Allen to endorse Rodney over Sam Massell, who I think I'd known since I was first moved to Atlanta, or certainly within a year or two. And we had a devil of a time with either one, because I think the business community was waiting to hear from Ivan. Who do you support? And it wasn't until late in the campaign we had been to see Mills Lane and a few other prominent folks. It was always, well, I want to hear from Ivan. And late in the campaign, he did, in effect, endorse Rodney. And that day, Mills Lane let Paul and me know, we here at the bank have $25,000 for you. So, and that sort of opened the pocketbooks, but it was late. And we could have done so much more had it been early. But that happened. And then, Paul began to run for the legislature. And from that point on, I'm really, rather than be involved in party politics, I'll take that back. I'm not sure. I think it may have been in late 70s, possibly the early 80s. I thought, well, maybe I'll run for the state legislature. I think I said in the late 70s or early 80s, I thought possibly I might even consider running for state chairman. And my recollection is I went to a meeting in Columbus, I went to a meeting in Macon, and maybe Dalton, and drove back, at night after the second or third one. I said, why would I even want to think about doing this?
What caused you to reassess?
Decide not to?
Yeah.
Just the fact that I didn't like the idea of driving somewhere and coming back at night. If that's the way it was going to be, I just didn't seem very interesting to me. I no longer had that much fire in the belly.
Right. Well, you were talking about Paul Coverdell earlier. Describe Paul Coverdell as sort of the professional and the politician, the political thinker that you knew and sort of watched his evolution into a political power in the state.
Well, initially, he was a terrible speaker. But an extremely conscientious citizen legislator. He really was. Towards the, I guess after he was elected senator, no, just before he was elected senator, I had made the comment to somebody that I had been the first contributor to every one of his campaigns. When it was after he was elected senator, and I said, except I have not contributed, this was like the day after he was elected senator, I have not contributed to his 1998 campaign, but he's already received contributions. He later said, "No, you didn't contribute to my first campaign. You contributed to every one of my successful campaigns, but I ran before you supported me, and I did not win that campaign." I didn't even remember that one. But Paul had a knack of pulling people together to help, say, do some research or any number of things. He was very conscientious. He seemed to work 110% of the time. He was not one of these gregarious type of politicians that greeted everybody and was the first one to grab a microphone. Just the opposite. Very conscientious, always willing to try to help another legislator who would then become somewhat endeared to Paul and be willing to support him. He introduced me, oh gosh, sometime in the 80s to Roy Barnes. And he and Roy had hit it off quite well. And, that friendship remained throughout Paul's lifetime. And I've had a good relationship with Paul. I mean, with Roy ever since.
How much credit do you think Paul Coverdell deserves for sort of fashioning what I'd call the modern Republican Party, sort of that post Watergate, post Reagan organization, where you had financial support from business community and a more broad-based support beyond Atlanta?
I don't know anyone who contributed nearly as much as he did to that progress. And first in the Georgia Senate, and then he took on, for the Bushes, the development of their support in the South. He was active in the Republican legislative, whatever the national structure is of the state legislatures, the Republicans. He really was active in so many things. I could recall, this is sort of symbolic, when he was the director of the Peace Corps. I used to get his schedule. Molly would send his weekly or monthly schedule to me. And I called her one time. I said, "Molly, you've got him going around the world in 8 days, and he's not spending the night anywhere. Where is he sleeping on this trip?" She said, "You know, Paul, he'll sleep on airplanes, or he'll be wherever he's stopping. He'll, a counselor or ambassador, he's just not booked into a hotel anywhere."
And you said that sort of work ethic was something that ever since 1969 he had. He,
in the family business, when the transition finally really occurred, where he was the leader rather than his father. And that wasn't easy. I was sort of the in-between.
And this is Coverdell and Company,
yeah,
his
insurance. This was I was sort of, if Paul had some issues with his father, it was not unlikely that he would get me to go talk to his father. Yeah. And, but, he was, in many respects, a full-time legislator, a full-time political activist outside of the legislature, And he was the full-time CEO, sales manager for Coverdale & Company. And I always marveled at his scheduling on his airplane travels. It was as if he never expected to have a delay in a flight anywhere. So how do you do that? You schedule 3 hours of meetings between 10 a.m. and 2, and you fly in 30 minutes before, and you leave 30 minutes after, and you think you're going to make a ball. And I said, somehow you do. I don't know how you do that. As additional disclosure, in 1987, and my oldest son, Michael, was living in New York, married, and his wife was expecting a child. And Paul was looking for some middle management people. And on some occasion that Michael and his wife Sharon came home, I mentioned to him that Paul was looking for middle management. Would he have an interest in coming back to Atlanta? Indicated he would. Paul had known him as a child because, 20 years earlier, when Michael was probably at most a middle teenager when Paul knew him. They hit it off. Paul hired him. He came back within a few months. When Paul went to the Peace Corps in '89, he and his father decided to make Michael both the president and CEO of Coverdale & Company. At the time, I said, Paul, I think you're making a mistake. Make him one, but not both, because he's only 31, and it could go to his head. You'd have a terrible situation on your hands. But he did very well, and as distinguished from Paul, who had 3 positions full time up to then, and Michael was only going to be involved in running the business. And he's organized. He's really quite well organized. And later on, when Paul did decide to run for the U.S. Senate, and after we floundered around with different finance chairmen, Michael stepped in and organized the fundraising.
Okay.
But he's never really been active in Republican Party politics.
Sure. Well, zooming out a bit, you got involved back, 1960 or so. 1946, if we want to count heckling Gene Talmadge during his campaign. Why do you think that the Democrats in the state of Georgia were able to hold on to power for so long?
Well, certainly through the 60s, well into the 60s, the county unit system was what they favored. And rural Georgia, even after that, people in office, who knows who they may have voted for president, but locally, there was no Republican organization in most of the counties in Georgia. There's a little bit in Columbus, a little bit in Savannah, a little bit in Augusta.
Mainly the cities.
Yeah, a little bit. It took a long, long time. And very frankly, Callaway's loss didn't help.
That it was just such a setback.
Right.
We've had now 2 Republican governors, two-term Republican governors in a row, along with the legislature. Do you see any really significant differences in the way Georgia Republicans have governed and led the state as opposed to Georgia Democrats, say like a Roy Barnes or a Zell Miller, Joe Frank Harris?
No, Not really.
What do you think the governing ethos is, if that's the right word, of those
I
in
really
charge?
think it depends on the personality of who's governor. I like Roy Barnes. I thought he was a good governor, and I think I would tell him to his face that I thought he lost because he got arrogant and pushed very hard to accumulate a big, campaign chest for re-election, and it was resented. Nathan Deal has turned out to be a far better governor than I ever expected him to be. I don't know that I expected much from Sonny Perdue, Joe Frank Harris, George Busby. I'm trying to think. Zell Miller was, I thought, an okay governor. Oh, by the way, going way back
Yeah.
to the Carl Sanders, after he was elected, he decided he wanted to have a new constitution in the state of Georgia. And so he created the 1963 Constitutional Revision Commission or something like that. And following through on that conversation that he had had with Randolph and me, he appointed me to the Constitutional Revision Commission. Supposedly, as the representative of the State Bar of Georgia. I wasn't active in the State Bar of Georgia, and an awful lot of people, I heard the rumor going around, who is he? And why is he representing us? But it was an interesting experience.
Were you that was just used as the guise to put a Republican on the Constitutional Revision Committee?
You know, they didn't know that he was putting a Republican on,
right.
But he was following through with what he told Randolph and me he would do. I mean, he didn't say he was creating this Constitution Commission and I was going to put Jarvin on it. He just said, you know, I'll appoint some people to positions that won't be specifically because they're Democrats.
Do you think, we've been now over a decade of a relatively solid Republican dominance in the state. Do you think there will come a time where the Democrats are either more competitive or return to power in this state?
Well, I think there will become more competitive. How they will do it and under what circumstances, I don't know. I don't think they'll become dominant again if their focus is primarily, as their current focus is, which is the African American community. Now, I'm going to tell you my view of what has caused an awful lot of the extreme positions of the parties and the nomination of their candidates. They're moving right now more and more to the left and to the right, rather than the middle. And I think, to a great extent, it's the provision in the civil rights legislation that requires districts to protect, quote, minority voters. It's unclear, really, to what extent or how far it could go. But what's happened in the gerrymandering is that in some respects, to create those minority districts, they dilute the minority vote in other districts. And with a reduction in the minority vote, you get more extremism in that respect. So until either the Supreme Court, through some sort of rulings, does something to cause a correction, I just don't think that'll happen congressionally.
How do you think the Republican Party has evolved since you became
You mean
active?
Philosophically?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, how has the Republican Party that is, shifted philosophically or evolved philosophically from your days of an Eisenhower Republican?
Well, I think both parties have moved to extremes, due in part, and maybe a major part, to, I think, the civil rights legislation that insists that minorities be protected in a way in which they are able to elect members of Congress or state legislatures without really competing for people with views that are not like their own. And whether that's extreme to left or extreme right. And, when I first became active, which was before the Goldwater era, and there was a fair amount of so-called bipartisanship. To some extent, that bipartisanship arose out of the fact that Southern Democrats were supposedly conservative. I personally think most of them were not economically conservative, certainly socially conservative, but I think they were more populist. Mm-hmm. And so they voted in a way where they thought they could get money back. So the Republicans that would vote for Democrat positions were the moderate to liberal Republicans that would be supportive of more socially progressive issues. Now, the one place where they had a tendency, both parties had a tendency to be bipartisan, was in foreign policy. Mm-hmm. But that stopped a long time ago.
How do you think, we're sitting here in 2018, Donald Trump's been president for 1 year, just over a year. How do you think a candidate like Donald Trump was able to capture the Republican Party's nomination and win the presidency with an ideological policies, especially economic policies, immigration policies that are starkly different from the policies of Reagan, Bush administrations, going back into the 1980s and even 1970s with Nixon and Ford?
Well, it certainly was baffling to me all during the campaign because he said so many outrageous things that I thought any one of them would have ended anybody else's candidacy. But I think there were several reasons. Number one, I thought the Democrats nominated or crowned a candidate that was terribly flawed. And that so many of the people that Hillary Clinton declared to be what was the term she used?
Deplorable.
Deplorables. That was one of the numerous words. Had really been supporters of Obama in 08 and 12. And they moved because they were, she was anathema to them. And by then, they may have soured on Obama's policies. So I think a great number of Democrats really moved into the Republican primaries. And they're the ones that voted for Donald Trump. I think the Obama policies contributed a lot to the reaction. And I don't know, maybe I don't think any of the Republican candidates took Trump seriously until way too late. And I really think we had too many candidates.
17, I think, was the
and
number.
If there were 4 or 5, there might have been a lot more cohesion in a primary that would have prevented him from winning.
Do you think that the Trump brand or policy set, however defined, will have a longer term impact on the Republican Party itself in terms of something like free trade, the movement of peoples?
I hope not.
Or even NATO and military alliances with Western Europe and elsewhere.
He is doing a number of things that people have talked about for years that should have been done, that nobody ever wanted to take on to do. I'm not so sure he's doing it out of intellectual process that has led to any serious decision making. He tends to have a gut reaction to something and moves on. I don't know. I can understand Mitch McConnell being terribly frustrated and not knowing what is it, Mr. President, that you are for. I mean, he tweets all over the place, and he says things all over the place. And while he likes that theory of, I think Trump likes the theory of keeping people in an uncertain state, because then he can deal with them. It can go on way too long, and it has.
So if you're looking ahead, 10, 20 years from now, we've had growth in the suburbs and in the cities here in Atlanta. The congressional district over the way was very, very competitive in what used to be a really strongly Republican district, the 6th district. What do you think the future of Georgia politics looks like in terms of competitiveness, of the future of the two parties, the two-party system?
I honestly, at the moment, don't see serious distinctions in political philosophy making Georgia more competitive between the two parties. I think it's still going to be a lot of individual personality, which certainly seems to have been the situation for most of my lifetime. And to some extent, that happens in the presidency. Everybody talks about how much of a problem Trump has created and is creating, and it's debilitating to the Republican Party and so forth and so on. And stop and think about, well, who are the Democrats thinking about will be their candidate for president in 3 years? I can't imagine it'll be Hillary or Bernie Sanders. Is it going to be Mr. Cuomo? It's certainly not going to be Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi. And during the Obama 8 years, the Democrats, lost 900 legislative seats around the country. Well, that's a lot of farm teams to build candidates. And I mean, I don't know of any senators that right now have much of an appeal, Democrat senators. Numerous times during the 2016 election, I thought the Democrats would be worse off if they lost than the Republicans would be if they lost, mainly because other than Hillary, and I didn't consider Bernie Sanders likely to ever get nominated, who was there? Who did Hillary prevent from running that would be an attractive candidate? Who knows? Maybe Oprah.
Stranger things have happened.
Yes.
Donald Trump became president.
Right.
Defying most people's expectations, for sure.
Well, one thing, if Oprah would run, I'm sure she would beat Elizabeth Warren, and that would be a plus.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Levison, for spending the afternoon with me talking history and politics. Really do appreciate it, sir.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and stay in touch.